Welcome to our summer session with Cathy Park Hong. Today we will be learning the craft and poetics of documentary poetry, essay, and other hybrid forms. We're thrilled to welcome Cathy and thrilled that you can all be here with us today. My name is Kyle Lucia Wu. I'm Kundiman's Programs and Communications Director, and you can feel free to message me if you have any questions today throughout the program with tech or anything else, and I'm happy to help you. To set the space, I'd love for everyone to think about how we can use this virtual gathering as a place of radical care and creativity, and just think about welcoming yourselves to one another. We encourage you to take risks and to be open to whatever comes, and to use the chat function as often as you'd like to connect with each other. Again, to those who are just coming in now, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, your pronouns, and where you're coming from. I use she, her pronouns, and I am joining from Brooklyn, New York, which is the traditional territory of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie people. I want to acknowledge this and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing how to learn to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. So while introducing yourselves and where you're calling from, we encourage you to acknowledge the traditional land if you know it. And there's a tool I can drop into the chat that can help you do this. And I'll drop it in here. If you are not familiar with Kundiman, we are a nonprofit dedicated to nurturing generations of writers and readers of Asian American literature. We offer programs like a mentorship lab for emerging writers, Wikipedia edit-a-thons for Asian American literature, food writing workshops, creative nonfiction intensives, a national reading series, and our 5-day retreat for poets and fiction writers. We also have regional groups across the country that organize programming locally. And if you want to learn more about us, you can visit us online at kundiman.org or find us on social media at Kundiman Forever. So before we begin, I just want to do a brief Zoom tour with everyone. At the top of your screen, you'll see speaker view and gallery view. So speaker view will highlight Cathy or whoever's speaking, but if there's a time that you want to see all the writers, feel free to hit gallery view. Please be sure to mute yourself if you are not speaking. And you can mute yourself and turn your camera on and off on the bottom left of your screen. We are recording this session, so if you do not want your face to be featured, please just feel free to turn your camera off. And we will be sending this recording out next week to all registered participants. The chat function is also at the bottom of your screen, and that's where you can send a message to the whole group or to one particular person. And again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to message me. To give you a quick sense of today's timeline, first Cathy will be giving a lecture portion and then a writing prompt, and then there will be approximately 30 minutes for Q&A at the end, though we may not have time for everyone's question, but that is the outline of the day. After this event, we will be sending out feedback forms because we would love to hear from you, and we would really appreciate if you could fill those out for us, so please stay tuned for those. We will send them out with the recording after this event. Yesterday, we sent out 3 pieces of reading for you, a document and a link, and I'm going to post those in the chat in just a minute in case anyone didn't get a chance to read them or wants to pull them up on their screen. And now I will turn the class over to Cathy, and I'm excited to learn with everyone, and thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. I am talking to you from the beautiful bucolic landscape of Vermont. I will be returning to Brooklyn in a bit, but I'm really excited to teach this class. It's really thrilling to see people from all over the place, from all over this country and beyond, Seoul and the UK. And as Kyle mentioned, I thought what I would do is that I will first talk about sort of the defining features of documentary poetics, which is not just limited to poetry, I should add. And then in the set, we'll go for a little break, and then we'll talk about we'll talk about the reading assignments, do a little generative exercise, and in the third section, we're going to do a little, we'll do some Q&A A. And so you guys, I wanted this to be as interactive as possible. So, I hate Zoom, but one of the benefits of Zoom is that it has this wonderful chat function. So you guys, you can, like, if you want to ask a question or anything, you could just, put it on chat. You could just throw it on chat, and I'll keep an eye on chat just to, and try to catch your question. You could also, and please feel free to do this, you could also just unmute yourself and volunteer with your voice as well. I would be happy to, you could do that as well. So there are a couple different options in which you can have your voice heard. And especially in the second section, I want it to be more like a discussion. So again, you could use either unmute yourself or use the chat function. I also wanted to say that I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but I noticed that one of the participants is a poet whose work I assigned for this class. And I'm not really sure if she's here. Vanessa Villarreal, if you are, would you kind of identify yourself on the chat box? Is she here? Maybe not. Yes, there she is. She's saying hello. Vanessa, you don't have to do this, but if you haven't read Beast Meridian, I have an excerpt of Beast Meridian, and it's really brilliant, and it's such a great example of docupoetics. And Vanessa, if you don't mind, later, just saying a little bit about either the excerpt or just your process working on the book, I would really be honored if you would. You don't have to answer now. You could have time to think about it. I totally understand if you just want to sit back and not, if you consider it labor, don't worry about it. But, I'm just letting you know. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think you already have some fans here. So, all right. So I'm going to get started. And I'm going to start talking about documentary poetics. And if you could, maybe in the participants, I'm actually curious how many of you are, you could raise your hand, do the blue hand, click onto the blue hand under participants. How many of you are poets? Yeah, okay, so there's some of you. And how many of you are fiction writers? Okay. And how many of you are nonfiction writers? And how many of you are all of the above? Yeah, I tend to be promiscuous myself with genre. So, and this is like the beautiful beauty of documentary poetics is that it's cross-disciplinary, and I'll talk more about that soon. So let me first talk about sort of docupoetics, why I thought it's kind of important to talk about now. I think, the kind of the noun and value of truth is something that we've been thinking about, that has been in the news and that has come up constantly, in among writers, right? And especially within the last 4 years. And I recall in 2016, right after Trump got elected, there climate scientists, I was reading this article where climate scientists were frantically copying data into independent servers because they feared that years of research would vanish under Trump's administration. Unfortunately, their fears were well-founded. Since then, the EPA has been completely gutted, has become toothless. Their website has been scrubbed. A lot of their research has vanished, and they're the EPA in name only. Because of Trump's administration, because of the way that social media disseminates the news, we've seen this kind of collapse of our shared reality, a collapse of shared reality. And in the meantime, I think what we're also seeing is a real kind of seismic change happening in the institutions that we have previously considered as hallowed, right? I think the best kind of the best way to kind of frame what's happening, this kind of press for change, is to think about, is this quote by Fred Moten, who wrote this book called Undercommons. And in Undercommons, he talks about he talks about the old Western image of old Western, Hollywood old Western image of the fort, the military fort. And what he talks about is how Hollywood has always led us to believe that the settlers, the heroes, are always defending themselves inside the fort from, these quote unquote savage natives. They are the invaders. They're the ones who are kind of trying to take over the fort. So what Fred Moten says that in fact it's actually the inverse. Hollywood has had it reversed. He's saying actually the military, the people in the fort, are the ones who are actually the invaders. And they're the ones who are taking over. They're the ones who are quote unquote savage, the savages who are trying to take what is not theirs. And then everyone outside the fort is, he defines as the dispossessed, or as the undercommons, or as the surround. And, this could be Black Americans, the indigenous, of course, formerly colonized, however you define the dispossessed. And what he talks about is how we have to kind of train our camera or center the people, center the surround. He talks about centering the surround. And what we're seeing here, what we're seeing happening now, I think, just in terms of in literature and in progressive politics, is this kind of breakdown of the fort. And the fort could be Western history, it could be the police, it could be the judicial system. This kind of defender of truth is becoming a defender of the 1% or the power. So I'm just trying, in this kind of cultural, historical, political upheaval, how as writers, living among that surround, as part of that surround, do we counteract the hypertrophy of false information and archive the present with the permanent ink of poetry? And I think there's been a lot of inspired, also I believe there's been a lot of kind of anxiety, like with, I think a lot of times we feel that the news is being, it's 24 hours news cycle is becoming the 10-minute news cycle, where, history is being pulled under us constantly like a rug. And how do we capture this moment? And this is, I think this has been on the mind of everyone. Or to quote Audre Lorde, there is no new ideas There are only new ways of making them felt, right? You could say the same thing about truth, you know, that there, you know, some of the truths that you're trying to kind of express are not new, but it's about making them newly felt. One of these truths are, and now I'm going to start, I have a little bit, I'm going to kind of share my screen here so that you can, so you can kind of read the quotes that I will be talking about here. Excuse my slowness. So here is Walter Benjamin. There is no document of civilization that is also a history of barbarism. You know, how, you know, and we have seen variations of this in many of the literatures that we've read. How do we make that feel new? Now, within the last 10 years or so, there's been a new genre that, actually longer than that, I mean, I would say a few decades. There's been kind of a new genre which has emerged called docupoetics. Other terms that have been thrown around as investigative poetics, poetics of inquiry, research-based poetics, or social poetics. And as I was saying before, it extends to all genres, nonfiction or fiction or poetry. It is by its very definition without formal boundaries. And I'll talk about that kind of boundaryless aspect of it later. Huh? Oh, I thought someone wanted to say something. Now I'm going to show you, I'm going to kind of break it down again. So, documentary poetics. So these are kind of like some of the defining, the 4 defining features that I'm going to talk about related to documentary poetics. You know, even there's been so many conflicting definitions of what it is. And I think some of you, probably a lot of you, especially those of you who have taken poetry classes, already I'm quite familiar with what documentary poetics is. And please, please share your wisdom, you know, in the chat function or out loud, because I would also love to hear what your idea of documentary poetics is. But even though there are a lot of conflicting definitions of what it is, all of its practitioners seem to agree that the documentary poem is, to quote unquote, is to quote the poet, to quote Muriel Rukeyser, extends the document. It extends the document. And so let me talk about that a little bit, extending the document. What exactly is a document? You know, documents are, it could be any, are both official and unofficial archives. There are history books. It could be history books, a constitution, treaties, court documents, dictionary of military terms, but it could also be it could be personal. It could be your own family album, photo album. It could be diary entries of your grandmother. It could be birth certificates. It could be like transcripts of oral testimonies, you know, your interview, when you interviewed your mother or your father. It's any source material that can serve as a kind of record. And what is, I think of what is probably very at the core of documentary poetics is this understanding that these archives are partial, that they're fragmented, that they're censored or have been expurgated, and therefore does not tell the whole story. And your position as a writer is to use your imagination and research to kind of complete that fragment in your own way. it is to also kind of interrogate and question what stories these documents have written over, and to understand what stray or renegade consciousness lies beyond the margins of these archives. So that's basically kind of, I'm just trying to clarify for you what Muriel Rukeyser means by extending the document. Now, a lot of formal approaches to, what Muriel Rukeyser is saying about extending the document is rather is varied, but a characteristic approach for docupoetics is to actually kind of collage in the primary source material themselves into the work to create a kind of assemblage, such as if you want to use excerpts of first-person testimony, legal and visual artifacts. What documentary poetics does is it repurposes, or to quote Susan Brianti, defaces the document to highlight her historical erasures and to poetically intervene upon canonized texts or government documents in order to expose what has been historically structurally excluded. And a lot of times, a lot of these poets use only found texts, So let me just show you a couple examples. Let's see. By the way, I don't have my chat function since I'm sharing this right now. I don't know how to. So if you, I'm not keeping an eye on the chat. If you have a question just right now while I'm sharing my screen, please just unmute yourself and ask it out loud. Ask your question out loud. So one example is, and again, the poets may already be familiar with this, is Jen Bervin. Who wrote in 2003, she published a book called Nets. And what it is an erasure of Shakespeare's sonnets. And I'm gonna open it up for you. It's a really beautiful book. This is the book, Nets. Here you have the cover. Can everyone see it okay? So here it is. So what you see here is kind of Shakespeare's Sonnet 2 is kind of faded into the background. And what she has done is she's sort of plucked out the words that she wanted us to read. And this is this is also another genre called erasure poetry, which is a form of found poetry where a poet takes an existing text and redacts or erase or otherwise obscures a large portion of the text, and thereby creating a whole new work from what remains. So what Jen Bervin has created here is almost like a palimpsest, right? Of here's Shakespeare's sonnet, and then here's another line, a weed of small worth asked to be newly made. Let's go on to the next one. Ooh, sorry. Okay. This is sonnet 20. Master, mistress of my shifting, by adding nothing, prick thee out for pleasure. And then here's another sonnet that's been kind of faded out. I use the whole, and yet I am not. And here, this one strand that she's chosen to kind of highlight in this poem, you could almost say is a kind of ars poetica, her like sort of this, just sort of, she's sort of announcing her practice where she's saying she's, like she's using all of Shakespeare's sonnets, and yet she's also playing with absence here. So stop sharing here. So basically, what she's doing here is like she's taking like Shakespeare sonnets, if you recall, whether you haven't read the sonnets since high school or whatever, or maybe you're a Shakespeare scholar, but the sonnets basically is about a triangulated relationship between an older mentor, a young man, and this mistress and this woman who both of them have an affair with. And she remains silent throughout. And what Bervin is doing is kind of highlighting that absent female voice in Shakespeare's sonnets. Let me show you another example of an assemblage poem. So that's Jen Bervin. I'm just going to quickly go through these, and then you can, let's see, here we go again. Okay, so that's another example. Let me just quickly give you another example. And all of these, examples deserve like hours of discussion on their own. And unfortunately, I am just skimming through them. Another example is Robin Coss Lewis, Voyage of the Sable Venus. This book, many of you might have already read it, won the National Book Award some time ago. And what it is here, what Robin Coss Lewis did was she wrote a poem using only the titles of paintings where a Black female body is present. And it could either be in Western history, so it's whether it's like it could be a white artist or a Black artist. And these are the rules that she set for herself. It's all found text. It's nothing, and she doesn't use any of her writing at all. And she says no title could be broken or changed in any way. She used various catalogs, and here no title was repeated. And so and this is just an example of, she devotes one section to this series of poems. And here it is, just using the titles. These are just the titles of paintings. I'll just read a little bit. Four-breasted vessel, three women in front of a steamy pit, two-faced, headfish trying on earrings, unidentified, young woman with shawl and painted backdrop, pearl of the forest, two girls with braids, people on a ship with some dancing girls, Our Lady of Mercy, blue. Oops. So I'm gonna stop share. So that's another example. Zong is also an incredible example as well. Someone just put that on the list. Zong is where M. Norbisi Phillips used a court document, and it's just a page long. And it's about, I believe they were Dutch. I could be wrong, and please correct me in the chat if it is. These Dutch sailors who were taking these slaves aboard. It was during the slave trade where they decided to actually drown all their slaves because they wanted the insurance money. And there's one document available, court document that summarizes what happened. And what M. Norbisi Phillips did was write a brilliant and really kind of chilling sequence of poems where she uses only the words of that court document, and it's called Song. It's really great. Yeah, and thank you for having the list. Does anyone have questions so far? And oh my God, it's already 2:33. Does anyone have questions so far?
Hi, yes, I have a question. My name is Shia.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, when you're looking for sources, how do you deal with like copyright, or do you just only try to find things that are sort of fair use? What is like the process, or do you even worry about that?
Oh God, is anyone an attorney? I think like first of all, you shouldn't worry about that. I like the copyright rules, laws are just so arcane in terms of what you can use or not. But I think if it's by a dead author, for instance, or if it's, you know, there's some documents like the Constitution and so forth where it's public use, you don't have to worry about it. But poets collage found text all the time, you know, it's not found. And so, you know, I don't think that you are likely to get in trouble if you do kind of manipulate other people's writing. But if anyone who knows anything about copyright rules and want to say something to kind of also respond to this, I would be really happy to hear as well. Yeah.
This is, yeah, I think that I've heard that as long as you use it and transform it in such a way that it's almost like a completely new thing, then you have an argument for it.
There was a big case where someone, I think, I don't remember this author, but she did kind of rewrite or her take on Gone with the Wind. And there was and there was a suit filed against her. And I think it was thrown out, if I believe, but I think someone should also fact check it as well. But I think if the text is manipulated enough, it's usually fine. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So let me just say, so the question, so why, after looking at these examples, you might ask yourself, well, why do docupoetics, why do they use their writing as an assemblage? Why do they collage these primary texts in? What's the reason for that? You know, a lot of times, you know, what Joseph Harrison said about the docu poem is that it often takes the archive inside out. And Philip Meters also said the investigative poem opposes the idea of a poem as a closed system. So rather than, what the docu-poem offers is that rather than the reader being like a kind of passive consumer, you know, rather than the writing itself becoming sort of content, what it is that the reader themselves is kind of act as a detective who kind of draw their own connections between the collage sources. So like if you go back to Jen Bervin's Nets, you sort of see, you kind of draw your own connections or your own meanings between, say, the words that she chose to highlight versus the sonnets themselves. And it also shows how the work that you're working on is not monologic, but it creates a conversation, a dialectic, an argument that in itself becomes its own imploded drama. Another docu-poet who I would recommend is, wait a minute, stop share actually. Is Salma Sharif, who collaged in military terms. And this is what, to her poems, and what she said about it is she's inserting the language of the powerful and the meek into poems to reveal their formal qualities so that the architecture of taken for granted language reveals its relationship to power. Text, the word text comes from, the root of it comes from this Latin word texere, to weave. Right? Let me just write here, texere. And by using these different sources into your poem, what you're doing is showing that knowledge is partial, it's not total. Rather than a seamless story, you're kind of exposing the rough weave of the writing. You're showing the relation between reader and text, between author and source. And by showing these relations, you're showing kind of the weave of it. Now I want to move on to, let's see. This is the Salman Sharif quote. Okay. All right. I want to say a little bit of something, a little bit about witnessing. Let me just see here. Another feature of documentary poetry is the poem as witness. Usually when we think of a poet, or when we think of the lyric form, we think of it as a very solitary form where the speaker is always kind of addressing this absent other. It's often, you know, kind of a travelogue of one's interior consciousness. But, you know, with this with documentary poetry, what is really essential is that there is a kind of community that's also being addressed. And that the poet is not speaking for that community, but becoming embedded or connected to community, whether they are outside it or not. And I wanted to, witness poetry is something that we've actually talked about a lot. Caroline Forche popularized it. But I think the most interesting kinds of docu-poets are poets who have a kind of self-conscious awareness of who they are as witnesses. And now and this is where this quote comes in, the appetite for pictures showing bodies in pain is as keen almost as a desire to show bodies naked. Yeah, someone wrote, Sontag's quote makes me think about the right of who is creating, made me wonder as I read the signed poem, The Colonel. Maybe we should go to, do you guys want to talk about The Colonel? Yes, no, yes, okay. Okay, let's get to it. I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to go to the poem. Does anyone want to read it out loud? Can someone volunteer to read it out loud?
There's an audio recording of her voice in it, actually. I like that a lot.
Okay, why don't we do that?
This poem is a documentary poem. It comes from May 1978 in San Salvador, El Salvador. It contains an obscenity. I feel I should announce that in advance. I believe it contains actually 2 obscenities. The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught the scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground.
Okay, so we got to hear it from Carolyn Forche herself. I'm just going to pull it up for it. Does everyone have a copy on screen or printed out? I'm curious, like, actually, I would love to like open this up for discussion, what your thoughts were about reading The Colonel. Now, The Colonel is actually a poem that has been anthologized quite a lot. Quite a few of you might have already read it before. Carolyn Forche was a human rights activist who was, I think she spent a year in El Salvador in the 80s, and she came back with a book of poems, and this poem Colonel is a poem that is often used a lot when people talk about poetry as witness. What is she doing? How does she approach witness? Or I'm just actually, you know what, I'm not even going to ask a question. I'm just curious, like, what your reaction is to this poem, first of all. And if you want to expand and talk about the role of witness in this poem, I would love to hear, because I'm already seeing that some people find it to be very chilling, someone said, but some of them, a few of other people are a little bit more skeptical about it as well. If you could also, I would love to hear your voices too. So feel free to unmute yourself and don't be shy.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, there's another person who goes first.
Why don't you start, and then Z, I think, can talk afterwards.
Okay.
Hmm?
Well, hello.
Hi.
Should I start? And I'm Z. Well, I'll just start since we're here.
Uh-huh.
First, that first line, "What you've heard is true," makes me think like that the poet, I don't know, that we would listen to the poet, but not anyone else. This kind of, that extension is like, oh, okay, now we can listen to this figure who is witnessing. And because it's in this like curated form that we'd listen to her.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, "Something for your poetry, no," is like one of the strongest lines for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because it almost is like, it's a little, I don't know if I feel a bit sinister about the poet. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. There's definitely something sinister, something menacing in the poem, and there's like, and it's something for your poetry. No, is also very kind of disingenuous and menacing as well. I completely agree with you.
It's like a gross moment for both of them, I
Yeah.
think, for the colonel and the poet.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Someone wrote, there's a reconsider the, I wonder if when he said something for your poetry, no, if she didn't actually still give him exactly what he wanted and what it means if she did. right? There's that kind of inherent contradiction there, right? Like she was like, she's recording this as a poetry for witness, but what's kind of complicates that is the fact that the general is asking that from her, right? She's he's mocking that. He's saying you could write this in your poem, go ahead, as kind of a challenge to her as well. Mariam Bazid, is that how you pronounce her name? You were about to say something as well.
I think it's been mentioned and I dropped something in the chat. No worries. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's already been mentioned. Okay. Vanessa, you talked about witness equals whiteness. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. Yeah, this poem, I first encountered it, I think, in grad school. And I remember I'd specifically asked about the required reading packets if there was any Latinx poetry. And someone said, oh yeah, the Colonel's in there. Mm-hmm. And, upon reading it, it fulfilled every stereotype and expectation that, would be sort of central to Latinx poetry, which is a focus on, or the expectation of brutality and savagery. So when we think about the way Trump characterizes gangs and, migrants as animals, and we think about like the sort of imperialist gaze on Central America, we focus on gang culture, brutality, violence, all of the things that drive migrants to the Americas, but not the violence of that gaze, and not the violent history that created those conditions, right? Which, capitalism, empire, anti-communism, all of this, colonialism, all of this stuff. And so I actually really appreciate Forsh's like scholarship, like the way she writes about this period, but the poem itself does have that anthropologist's gaze, like this like othering and sort of flattening of the politics, but not of the detail. So I do appreciate like the way the detail is working in the poem, but it still does have this exoticizing force behind it. I don't know. I think that's maybe what people are sort of discussing in the chat. And so I just question what witness means, like what the inherent positionality of witness is, and who gets to witness as someone whose life is absent of violence, witnessing violence, like what the inherent sort of safety of that position is, and how witness is a position of whiteness. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's what I meant by my little pithy comment.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I add on to that? Yeah, so thinking about witness and the sort of inherent culpability of this position of witness as a survivor, which I think like many people have really discussed thoroughly. I wonder about the limits of self-reflexivity, because I do think that's what she's doing when she gives life to the ear on the floor, even though they're dead. There's this recognition of her own complicated position as an outsider, and the taint of permission given to her by the Colonel with his question. There was this article that I really liked in the New Yorker yesterday about this sort of self-reflexive turn that we've been using to kind of sort of acknowledge our culpability, but also there is a tendency for that acknowledgement to be the end. So like, we've recognized our guilt, that's fine. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to add on to the sort of many, the ethical entanglements that we're working with when we talk about docupoetics.
May I share?
Yes.
Yeah, along these same lines, I was sort of wondering like what makes this witness that kind of points to a whiteness feel like unrealistically passive. And I noticed that like a lot of the verbs that are associated with the speaker are like passive. I actually don't really know the correct grammatical terms, so someone can help me out here, but it was like, I was asked how I enjoyed the country. I was in his house, like that is like a naming of a presence, but it's like the eyes are sort of they're made to be passive, and then the way that by the time the line like something for your poetry, no, and even though that there's sort of like a threat there that's attached to the kernel, it almost made the witness become a victim in an odd way, or like I don't know. So like there's this unrealistic like power dynamic that gets set up. And then I was also noticing some of the ways like certain things were named, like in English, it was in Spanish, a type of bread, and not like I don't know. So there's a certain way that gaze gets unconvincing in terms of like the viewer, I guess like the witness being kind of just like eyes or ears. And then it made me wonder like, what is the you? Is the speaker like one of the ears? I don't know. But it made me also think about like there's this interview which I'll drop in the chat about and actually Solmaz Sharif and I think Ricky Laurentis, I don't know her pronunciation. About how like empathy becomes this tick that gives like permission to like write into like crises or violence. And actually Solmaz says something about like pity being perhaps like even more useful, kind of in an ironic way, where at least like it leads to some kind of like entanglement that realistically describes the power dynamic versus empathy, which is sort of this passive standing by. I don't know where I stand on that, but it made me think about that. So I'll just drop it in the chat.
Could I say something?
Sure, yes.
Yeah, I mean, just to hop on to what everyone else is saying, I agree with those comments and sort of the ethical considerations. I mean, I think to sort of just to play devil's advocate, that there is, so I feel like this poem is also sort of filling a gap between journalism and poetry, where a lot of times when we read journalism, we're simply the reader, or sorry, when we read journalism, the reader of the journalism is forced into the act of the witness, which can be a lot of labor and a trauma as well. And so in a way, the speaker of the poem is shouldering that burden of the witnessing for the reader, which I think is interesting. And also a lot of times in journalism, we're not sort of given an ethical direction. And this poem also gives us a richness in providing that.
Yeah. I think there are definitely some I think like self-reflexivity can be efficacious if we're talking about like just the way, if we're thinking about the traditions of journalism, but at the same time I wonder, you know, like Carolyn Forche wrote this a long time ago, and perhaps some of the questions of what being a witness was not as pronounced in discussion. I think she's also kind of talked a lot about sort of the political role of witness, what Poet as Witness in her anthology Against Forgetting. And a lot of the criticism that has come up about her role as witness is, and she said this herself, and it's fascinating to look back at this as an archive, comparing it to now, where she was saying that, you know, these are a lot of poets, poets who are witness poetry is about a poet who records an extremity, you know, a historical extremity. And then she goes on to say that, you know, we as Americans are not used to this because a lot of these extremities happen elsewhere, over there and not over here. And and so there's a kind of, so we're isolated from a lot of these kind of political atrocities that are happening. And it's a little bit ironic reading that in 2020 now about about her saying this. But I think perhaps some of the issue is that with this poem, is that there's no, and it's unfair to say this about a poem, but like, there's no kind of implication of who she is, the connection between there and here. Well, what is the American involvement in what's happening here in El Salvador? And there's also, as people have pointed out, there's no presence of the victims themselves. And there's something kind of discomforting about the fact that what you have heard is true. I was in his house. I read this book as both, this poem as both journalistic, but also kind of an interrogation where she is being forced to confess herself as a poet. So there's this kind of like, she's both a storyteller, but it's almost like she's also being forced to tell the story. And so it goes from the end, something for your poetry, no, and it goes back to the top, what you have heard is true. It's both like a witness account, but it's also almost like a confession. And that is also kind of, you could also see that through broken, the moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. And then, so you have like the interrogation room, the light, and there's a kind of violence that kind of surrounds a house. There's a kind of, there's a lot of hints in the interior space. But I do agree, there's also this almost kind of fetishization that happens with these details, that they're both very detailed, but also inexact at the same time.
If I can say something.
Yeah. So.
I'm sorry, your name is Keith, right? Do you want to say something? And then someone else can also talk too.
This is my first time of hearing of the poet and of the poem.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and appreciates everyone's comments on it. What it said to me only on the first hearing, and I haven't read it, but what it said to me was, this was, sort of documenting a class of cultures, and it's a coming to, old world going out and a new world is coming in, and the details around having a gold bell for a maid made me think of someone, want to talk about their wealth and their ability to have servants. Also the daughter and the son kind of going about their ways, oblivious to the world around them, while the colonel's cutting off ears and putting them in the shopping bag, kind of suggested to me that he doesn't hear from anyone else. He only hears from himself, and towards the end, when the ears hit the ground or hit the water, and then all of a sudden they become alive, suggests to me that you can suppress the truth for only a period of time, but at some point it's going to rise. It's going to rise back up. So I had a whole lot of different thoughts about her choice of words and what was happening. But it did seem to me like she was documenting the old world going out and perhaps a new world coming in. Was my first reaction to that. And then I had a question. Is Amiri Baraka's poem that he did about 9/11, where he lost his job, somebody blew up America, would that be considered bearing witness? Would that fall into this category? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
Well, this poem, I agree. I think this poem has a lot of symbolic richness, with the gold, with the gold bell and the rack of lamb. The rack of lamb is both a symbol of class and, that there are of a different class and they are afforded these luxuries that other people who are not in the poem do not have. Also rack, there's also kind of does something double-edged about that. The rack is also kind of suggests a torture and so forth. And for that, the poem is really powerful. You also wonder, well, is there too much symbolic value, weight to each of the details. Like so the poem, you know, at the end when they talk about when she talks about the ear, you know, these are immediately at the end, because there's so much at the end in the epiphany. The poem at the end is the epiphany of the ear is becomes dematerialized as a symbol, you know, of witness, of listening, of hearing, rather than what it is as these, you know, these mutilated body parts, you know.
I like to think of
someone else wanted to say, was that you?
It was me. I
Okay.
wanted to say that I like thinking about the ears also just as a haunting, like not just as the like very obvious, like here's a thing that heard, but the colonel himself is like keeping them in a jar and maybe they're in his dreams. But I wanted to say about the conversation before that, that one thing that's striking about the sort of like the conversation of witness, whiteness, all of that is that, Cathy, what you were saying about the work that the reader does to the poem in sort of like connecting the history, the gaze of the poet, all of that, that like it's not possible in 2020 to read this poem without having all of us sort of engaging in this background conversation as well, and that now feels like it's like part of the package, that we get to think about like who got to tell the story. Anyway, I was thinking.
Yeah, no, that's, thank you for that. I mean, I wrote an essay called Against Witness, and I'm actually, we should go on a break very soon, but I think there's so many interesting points that are brought up that I also want to raise this as a discussion as well. I mean, you know, a couple people pointed out, and this is my problem with poetry as witness poetry, is that now it does sound a little bit passive, right? There is something inherently passive about witness poetry, which I actually wrote about it for a poetry foundation against witness, which someone just posted on a chat function where witness, what is, you know, has poetry been displaced by the technological advancements that we have made? And in the essay, I write about how, like, Michael Brown, when Michael Brown was murdered, or when George Floyd was murdered by the cop, all of us were witnesses. You know, eyewitness accounts are now just so accessible. There is this sense that proximity between us and the catastrophic itself have been completely collapsed because of iPhones, because we could see what is happening. And despite the fact that there have been many witness accounts, justice is not being served. You know, we're still even after testimony after testimony after testimony, it's still the same result. It's still the same kind of, sentence where, like, the cops are acquitted, or the laws are still not changed, or the police is not defunded, or anything like that. So I want to ask you, all of you, this, because you guys are so, I mean, I think you brought up so many brilliant points about Caroline Forcher's poem. What are the works that really, where the poet as witness really does penetrate, where it doesn't seem passive to you? Or is that all that a poet can be? You know, is witnessing enough? Am I making sense here? Oh, yes, please rate, let's see, Kavita?
I just had a question about, and I think someone else had this question as well, which is that if you are not direct witness to what you're writing about, but you're writing based on the perspective of those who were present, is that witness poetry? Is it kind of an indirect witnessing? And of course, you know, there is the complication that you are layering your own perspective on that, that has to be acknowledged. So that was just a question I had. I think particularly when it comes to writing about immigrant histories, whether it's familial or others, that's something that comes up.
Witness poetry or writing about or docupoetics can be firsthand or secondhand or thirdhand. You could be the person, you could be the survivor, or you could write about it from another survivor's perspective, or you could write about the victims. You know, it doesn't really matter how close you are. But I think this is a good. This is this is one of like perhaps one of the more. I don't want to say ethical. I would say it's one of the more. For me, affecting, powerful, let's just say, ways, approaches to witness poetry. When I know that the poet is asking this question, and this goes back to the Susan Sontag quote, and this is not, it doesn't have to be someone outside your experience. It could outside your community. It could be like your mother. It could be you. You know, I think like when you're writing about injustice or suffering or pain in certain ways, you know, it's there's so many expectations on how it's supposed to be written that you know, whether it's very personal or not, you're still kind of going to be thinking about how it should be written. But you know, you know, when you're recounting pain in some way, pain of your own pain or the pain of others, you might ask yourself, who am I writing this pain for? Like a truism that I think really is at core to documentary poetry is that, you know, it abides by that truism that it comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable, right? And you might think yourself, what I'm writing afflicting the comfortable or comforting the comforted? You could, one can argue about the kernel. The kernel, some of you seem to think that it's actually comforting the comforted. You know, witness equals whiteness. Who is for? And as you're writing about this experience, you might think, am I turning this pain into a monument for others to gawk at, or is it a story that's almost unbearable to look at because most of its victims are no longer there to tell it? And I think, you know, images of suffering, going back again to go back to the Sontag quote, and this is what I write about in Against Wince's Witness, images of suffering can arouse our horror where it simulates an elusive identification between us and the victim before we are conveniently deposited back into our lives. So it's like, it could almost be like this kind of ride, right? You're like experiencing what the protagonist is experiencing. Afterwards, you're like, oh, and this is where sort of the limitations of empathy come in. Although I do think empathy is really important. You're like, oh, I understand now, and that's it. And, you know, maybe like when, as docupoetics, you might think, not, okay, not just, you don't want to just have the fantasy of witness, but also to think about another Sontag quote, how do you put the reader in the same map as the victim suffering? You know, that you could call that complicity, although I do think that word complicity has been used quite a lot. Maybe a better word or more productive word would be responsibility. What is the responsibility of the reader when you read about someone's suffering? So you want to draw that connection not only of empathy, but also I think of responsibility as well. You know, and this is where, and I talk about this in Trinity Minha's book, in Trinity Minha's quote in my book, where she talks about writing nearby your subject rather than writing about your subject, where you know, where actually there is this kind of where you acknowledge sort of the distance between yourself and the subject matter, and so that you are so you're acknowledging to the reader that your knowledge of the subject matter is not total, it's partial, and you don't know everything, that there is an uncertainty to it as well. And it's to make that kind of proximity transparent. It's to make that distance transparent between yourself and the community, whether it's your mother or whether you know, you're writing about an indigenous community that you have no real connection to. But I think these are questions you should ask yourself too. First of all, why, especially if you're writing about another person's experience, and this is what Alex Chi wrote. He wrote a great article about this in New York Magazine. You should first ask yourself, why do you want to write about this person's experience? The second one is, audit your bookshelf. Have you read books by authors from that community? You know, and then of course, if you haven't, really, you know, do your research, but then also at the same time, I would say, really kind of examine your connection to that community as well. You know, both like emotionally, but also your power relations, the relationship of power between yourself and that community. You know, if where you're standing has any effect on that community. I'm just looking at some of the comments here.
Can I throw in a comment? Sorry, this is RJ.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting is, you know, we're looking at the text, we're looking at analysis, making comparisons through other modes of how to understand. But one of the things that I was kind of curious about in terms of our role as writers, in terms of our choices, people talk a lot about intention, but I think there's a deep problematic about assigning intention as writers, because it loops back into the idea that authorship intention, authorship meaning, again, is the origin of the source of meaning. And I'm kind of more curious about the idea that writing itself is working with material language as an act, as a deliberative act, even if you're not always in control of the meaning, because it's not a closed loop. And so what can we do in our care of how we use language which is structural, and who has power, and the kind of symbolism, and the modes of structures. Like song is a great example. They were taking 2 pages of documentation, but specifically trying to force the fact that you had to have a speaker utter and give presence and time and space as witness, as the audience had to read it. So what are the, you know, I think it bears consideration more about our techniques that we use to use language as material to position ourselves in this landscape of other texts. And I'm sometimes curious about that kind of that notion that we have a deliberative responsibility to the acts that we do, you know, agency and the responsibility of our acts. And kind of wondering if there's other kind of ways that we look at text as a material act. Because that's where, you know, that's the role we have as writers, essentially, is my thinking. And then being able to think then in what way we might have different techniques to access. And, you know, given the landscape of great comments that we've had.
Yeah, no, you bring up a lot of really interesting points that I want to talk about. It reminds me of, and I don't know if this is responding directly to what you're saying, but it reminds me of Lynn Haginian's essay, The Rejection of Closure, right? Where she talks about closed text versus open text, when it's like a closed text, and that would be like anything you read on the internet, content that you read on the internet, or you know, or some best-selling novel, is where, or you could maybe even say this about the Kernel, though I don't know, where it's a kind of work that is bears a lot of emphasis on epiphany. You read it, and then you have the work gives you the answers, and then you are satiated, and that's it. Whereas an open text, which is what documentary poetry offers, is that you have to do the work yourself, like Zong pronouncing, whether you part with the reader, and this is very essential for documentary poetry, where the audience or the reader is sort of more participatory. There's a participatory aspect for the reader in a way that makes them uncomfortable, which also has, I think, its own limitations too. Another aspect of documentary poetry that I wanted to bring up that I think also helps kind of combat that is that the documentary poetry kind of, you know, going back to Joseph Harrison's quote, it takes the archive inside out, right? So you're seeing this in unlike, like, say, like a kind of a time-based narrative, right? Where you see everything that's happening, where it's very seamless, where the narrative very seamless, and there's like a dramatic arc. You're seeing the seams of the sources. So you're seeing the attributions, right? Where you're seeing the people who you've interviewed, or the books that you've quoted and so forth. There's all, attribution becomes its own form of art form. And I think that's also very important to attribute where you can. I'm thinking of another example, like a bad example is, and I'll give you some good examples later, is an anti-docupoetic book, is this book called Bookseller of Kabul by, I think I'm mispronouncing her name, Asni Searstad. She's Scandinavian, and she wrote a book where she wrote about this Afghan, she lived with an Afghan family for 3 months, right? And wrote about their family. When it was published, it became an international bestseller, but she wrote about, divulged some of their secrets without their permission. But also what was really kind of off-putting about it was also that it was, the journalist was not a presence she herself was not a presence in the book. It was all told in this kind of omniscient narrative. So her Western condescension of their customs were seen as objective truth, rather than what she's saying. It's called The Bookseller of Kabul. There were a couple people. Kyle, do you think I should go on it? Do you guys want to go on a break? Do you want to continue talking? What do you think? Kyle, what do you think?
We can go on a short break, yeah. If that works for everyone.
Okay, let's go for a short break, okay? Quick 10-minute, sure, yeah. And there were a couple other people, Naomi and George raised your hands, and we could get to you afterwards, after the break, okay? Just like let's say 10-minute break? Or how about about an 8-minute break? Okay, all right.
Hi there, is anyone gonna stay here in the call?
Yeah, I'm gonna stay in the call. Hello.
No break crew. Woo.
Hey, because I've got my hot drink, so I don't need to go for a break.
Oh.
This is actually for me. I don't write. I don't formally do any creative writing. This is like really. It's really cerebral. It's really like it's a lot. It's a lot for me to kind of take in. Like I'm really enjoying the discussion, but I'm also a little bit hungover. So I'm like, oh, I wish I wasn't hungover right now, because this is obviously like really really introspective, really complex like stuff. But so I'd be like, yeah, I would love to like hear what both of you have to say about it.
Well, I was gonna say something not negative, but I'd love someone to kind of help me, because honestly, I think that I'm kind of starting to have second thoughts on the power of documentary poetics. Because right after the Colonel stuff, and when he said like something for your poetry, no, and then like, right after that line, she creates the epiphanic moment of like the ears on the ground and the ears catching the scrape of his voice. I think what I get from that is like, it's really powerful, right, as a poem. But then personally, I feel like both she, the poet, and myself feel utterly powerless. Like, okay, what's the best she can do? So she does make poetry out of it, and right, so she turns the ears into a symbol. But what I think about in particular is this, like, there's this like really famous Adorno quote that's like repeated so often. I'm sure like most of you all know this already. Poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. But there's also, he did an explanation of that. Let me try to see if I can find that quote. He said later on, like explaining, because he got a lot of flack for it. He said, after Auschwitz, our feelings resist any claim of the positivity of existence as sanctimonious, as wronging the victims. They balk at squeezing any kind of sense, however bleached, out of the victim's fate. So now, just after this poem, I feel weird about the act of making poetry out of suffering overall. Obviously, we need witness. So I'm not saying, oh, stop doing that and whatnot. But I think, I don't know, I'm just not left with a good, I guess maybe it is meant that I'm not supposed to feel good afterwards. But now I'm just really doubting whether or not documentary poetics is actually useful or powerful. So I'd love to hear anyone, combat, like push against my thought and whatnot. So yeah.
Well, it would be very sad that 200 people are in this workshop if it turns out that the answer is no. I think Ellie, I'm not sure how you want that pronounced. You've already mentioned Claudia Rankine much earlier, but for me, I think when I think about documentary poetry, it's a little sad that we've been reading the Kernel for so long, because I think when I look at this chat, this poem was not written for anybody in this Zoom call.
I think this poem just hasn't really aged that well, because it was like published in when like what, the late 1970s, like 1980s. Like I think it definitely, under the type of literary analysis and the type of conscious as like readers that we have like today, this poem is not something that it's not going to stand up that well, unfortunately. But I do agree with everyone's points, though, that it is like a very passive witness. It kind of has a double consciousness, actually, because it's not just the narrator sort of putting in what they said happened in there, but it's also the narrator looking back. So I just think that sense of distance, it's a little bit I guess it's a bit disconcerting, if that's the best way I could put it.
Yeah. I'm really new to poetry and whatnot, and I only took this class actually just because I'm reading Cathy Park Hong's stuff, so I just wanted to see what she's like. So like I had no idea what documentary poetics are, or in general a lot of poetry. But I'm curious. So like, if the kernel is like kind of like the old poetry, and we've kind of moved on in terms of kind of technical skill and also the philosophical content, what is I don't know, what is like the current form of documentary poetics supposed to be doing rather than standing witness? Because I think my big hang up is I'm wondering what is the meaning of standing witness anymore if we're just kind of left with the feeling that we're utterly powerless in one way or another.
I think
sorry, can I throw in just one quick comment? So the idea that it's a trajectory of a clear progression is, I think, a mischaracterization. I think one of the reasons why she points to this is because the issue is still relevant. She had mentioned conceptual poetry. Michael Brown's Body was very much an instance where an institution of white poetic power allowed a person with a protected position as a professor to use the institution of his university to speak on a dead person's body as if it was nothing, and then to rearrange the words to end up using the last sentence that he spoke at the memorial for this person, for Michael Brown, as if the mere mention of his genitalia was to diminish him. There are still issues going on. There's absolutely other poetics where we still have power, but it's still going on. It's not over. This is why it matters that we still attend to the way that other people use language to harm, as witness or not. We still have that fight going on. And so to act like it's just done with, like it's in the past, is not to look at the world as it is. Why do you think people are protesting? We still have issues, not just out in the streets, but in the poetry rooms and in institutions. And they still have money and they still have power. So yeah, there are definitely ways that we're making an effort, but it's not over. And so definitely there are ways, but like it's not over.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that, thank you for that. I think one of the reasons that I personally enjoy Claudia Rankine a lot is that when I read her poetry, I feel like it gives me the feeling that I'm like not doing enough in my life to like change, right? And I don't think, it's definitely not right to, I think, place the burden on any writer, especially not a writer of color, to say like, oh, like our job is to like encourage change always. I think it's different when the writer when the speaker is, you know, not, I like to say, ensconced in privilege. Because then instead of being kind of alienating, which is what this poem feels to me, it becomes validating, right? And I think validation is very important for any audience that doesn't get to feel that very often. But coming back to Claudia Rankin, I feel like especially in Citizen, also a little bit in Don't Let Me Be Lonely, there are parts of her poetry that feel like an attack against the audience, because I think that she understands that a large amount of the people who are going to be reading her are people who occupy like positions of an oppressor. And I think she actively uses emotions beyond, like, I think there was a discussion earlier about like joy and suffering. She also actively uses emotions like disgust or anger or pride, which to me are emotions that drive change, whereas like joy and sadness and sorrow kind of like, to me, are kind of like these static feelings that move on to other things that drive change.
I'm gonna admit, I feel like I might have missed like an earlier part of the conversation, but I think RJ brings like really good points that yes, these issues are indeed like ongoing. One thing though, I am sort of wondering that though is that even as like people of color who we sort of write about, say, our own family's experiences, or we write about the trauma that we inherit or the intergenerational trauma with our own families. I think especially for diaspora folks though, at the end of the day, we've been raised and educated in a mostly white dominated, white controlled, a system taught mostly by white teachers. So if anything, I feel like a big step is sort of just decolonizing like our own, I'm not really sure what's the word for it. But it's sort of just decolonizing like our own sense of analysis or like writing as well. So I think in the question of like presenting the joys and the pains, I guess, of our own individual experiences, half of me sometimes wonders like, to what extent are we like presenting them in a way that it is sort of almost like in a white gaze or in a sort of white voice sort of way, but that's just because of the system that we were born and raised in as members of the diaspora.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to respond that I think I can understand that we all live under a system where history and literature is very white dominated, but to not state everybody's experience as being taught by white teachers, surrounded by a white community, because that's not necessarily always true of diaspora folks.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely grew up, I'm from SoCal, I'm in a region where it's predominantly Asian, so I was like very privileged not to be in that situation, but I definitely do question though, when I am like writing these experiences or when I am trying to unpack these experiences, like how much of it is coming from a viewpoint that has been like, I guess is influenced by this like white dominated system too. I don't know. It's been my food for thought.
I think it's really great.
Oh, sorry. I think it's oh, sorry. Just like none of us are ever going to be outside the system. Sorry, I am a Foucauldian. I don't know. I'm in the academy. You can't really, there's no escape basically. So I think it's just that, I think recognition is important. I think that I found what Cathy said earlier about distance and recognition and finding the formal strategies to acknowledge the frames whenever you write is possibly what we have to be able to unmask the what is the word I'm looking for, but basically unmask the structures, right? And to recognize that we can never really go out of that.
Can I say something, you guys? I was eavesdropping for the last 5 minutes, and I think you guys bring up some really great points. And I think I do want to say, and I think we need to move on from Kernel. I want to talk about Banu Kapil and Vanessa's Beast Meridian, which are such brilliant works. But sometimes I do, it's important to think about the questions of witness, but at the same time, I do think that when we this fear or this kind of self-reflexive thinking about the white gaze can itself, in and of itself, be a little bit crippling, and it can be a little bit crippling and make you feel self-conscious. And so far we have talked about, and I think there's been a lot of discourse around rightly so, but I think some of it could also be a little bit detrimental, where you have the right to write about other people's experience. What are the ethics about writing about even your family members? What are the limitations of witness poetry? How can you be a witness in a responsible way? This is really good, I think, as discussion, as readers. I think this is really important to think of as readers. But as writers, you also want to kind of, and I know I'm contradicting myself here, but you also want to kind of disengage from that too. And I think, what I was going to say, like, if witness seems to be passive, you could think of it in a different way, which is, instead of thinking of writing as a witness, think of writing as an intervention, right? Writing as intervention. And and that doesn't involve a really kind of complicated formula. Just the fact that you, as as an Asian American writer, or as someone as like or a Latinx writer, writing your story is intervention enough, is intervention enough. And because you are for so long, your stories have been out of circulation. And you're putting your stories back into circulation, or you're short-circuiting that circulation by writing your story. Documentary, and so I want to say that. And another thing that I want to talk about is there is also limitations to, of course, being self-reflexive, right? Like, and being like, okay, there's almost sometimes that self-consciousness can feel a little performative, right? Like, I'm so privileged. We hear that a lot on social media constantly. I think what's really, when Trinity Minha talks about writing nearby versus writing about, when it's most successful is not when you're self-consciously talking about your privilege, but more about bearing your own vulnerability. Allowing yourself to be vulnerable, opening yourself up, and just acknowledging that you don't know anything, and that you're a little bit scared of whatever that you're writing about, and allowing those feelings to emerge when you're writing about, or whatever insecurities or uncertainties that you have. I think readers really appreciate that. And if you kind of access those kind of emotional valences, that will also make your work a lot richer too, and add a more complexity to your voice. So I wanted to, do you guys have any other questions, or let's see. Oh, there's so many. I hope.
I just think there's, I don't know,
Yeah.
the two hands maybe.
Oh yeah, the two hands, yes. Naomi and George, before we go on to vertical interrogation of strangers.
I just wanted to, push back a little bit with idea about witness, and that it's just this problematic. And I'm just thinking of Elizabeth Alexander's "Can You Be Black and Look at This," which really puts this traditional idea of witness as just looking, in a very visually centered kind of experience, a visually centered experience, which is very much that poem. And she talks more about embodiment. I feel like that's something we could also just throw in the mix of what ideas that are floating around here. The idea of going beyond the visual, because often we rely on the visual and witness as a visually centric experience. And this is, I feel like, especially important right now when folks, especially Alexander is talking about Black folks watching the Rodney King video. And that is literally what's happening with all of these videos now. Like, you have to watch in order to be able to, is happening, but you can't literally not be part of a collective feeling that you are being you know, you're literally being, you know, erased, you're being murdered or whatever, that the violence is happening to you. Like there's a collective witnessing that's happening there. And I feel like that's a really important point that we don't want to throw out with the problematic aspects, that, you know, there is such thing as being a collective to violence, and that's very present right now in this moment. You know, who could possibly have shot that Ahmaud Arbery video, except it just, watching that video, I immediately was like, how come no one's mentioning the fact that someone taped this video of someone being murdered? You know, someone, it already speaks to that issue, and like the fact that a collective witness of violence that's being done to your community, and watch and tape and capture.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's, I'm sorry, your name is?
Naomi.
Naomi, yes. Thank you so much for that. I mean, there is also, there's so much, I don't know. I mean, you bring up so many interesting points, you know. Yes, we cannot discount collective witnessing, or how witnessing has, there's a problem. It's both problematic in that people can now just sort of passively observe, or the way these images are circulated, so and circulated so much that it desensitizes us from the people who are in pain. However, at the same time, collective witnessing actually does, it's, you know, there are moments where, I mean, you see it now, it actually does lead to action, as we're seeing now too, with the protests, of course, that's happening. And a lot of the, of course, police brutality wouldn't have been made public without these iPhones, and it's like one of the few weapons of self-defense that we have. So here, if you look at it that way, witness can be a self-defense weapon, as actually a practical kind of self-defense mechanism in its own right. And so, and then in a way, that's what, like, also documentary poetry is a kind of collective witnessing. And it's also what poetry can bring, I think, or fiction or nonfiction writing in this period of the pandemic, where we are privileging eyesight without hearing or smell or taste or anything like that. Everything is just absolutely image saturated, so that we're like, I just feel like my eyes are becoming sunburned, you know, where you're just becoming exhausted. What poetry can bring is that it brings the body back, as you're saying, it brings the body back into witnessing. Where you are, where you're not, and it's not just empathy where you're walking around the other person's shoes. It's also, that is important to, like, you know, bringing the body back into witness, is what being able to walk in other people's shoes, but it goes beyond that. It's like walking in the other person's shoes and be like, what can I do? I mean, maybe just ask. It's not like you're offering solutions at the end, but maybe leave the reader with a question that lingers in their mind, that they cannot stop thinking about, rather than a sense of resolution and like, oh, now everything is good, there's a happy ending, and so forth. And that will also, that kind of question at the end, and this is what Baldwin is like, it's, you know, when I read essays or nonfiction especially, I go to nonfiction with questions, and I leave with more questions, you know? And what those questions offer is maybe leads us closer to that collective responsibility as well. And I think also, I'm just like looking at some of this thing. Should we go to Banu Keppel? I am going to, sorry, Where are you? Okay. Do you see? Hi. There's so many really intense questions raised, and I hope we get to actually save the chat, all of the kind of insights made on chat. And I don't know, I wonder if there's an opportunity for you guys to continue on, for all of you to continue on this conversation beyond the 3 hours that are allotted to it, because I do want to talk about Banu Capital. One thing I want to say just quickly a little bit about genre and docupoetics, and I think vertical interrogation of strangers allows for, is a great example of a genreless project. As I was saying, you can involve fiction or nonfiction, even visual art and performance, and and what it does, it's sort of similar to conceptual art, which is not related to conceptual poetry, which is that conceptual art is not tied to any one medium, which is it's not tied to painting or video or drawings or whatever. What conceptual art prioritizes is the subject, is the concept, is the idea. And then what the artist does is that it uses whatever medium necessary to kind of realize or document that idea. Another kind of corollary, visual art corollary, is social practice art, which is art that, visual art that is less object oriented and more about the interaction between the artist and the audience, and the kind of activism that is generated from that. Now, one of the more successful examples of that is this artist, Rick Lowe, who with funding bought row houses in Houston and turned them into artist studios, as well as living spaces for socially impaired single mothers. But in a way, I want to, what documentary poetry does is it opens up sort of the narrative possibilities. I think, Jane Allison in this great book called Meander talks about sort of how we tend to kind of write narrative, we treat narrative, when we write narrative, we're so used to this kind of time-based cinematic narrative where there's often a dramatic arc at the end, right? And she says that, that dramatic arc is based on a man climaxing. And she's like, well, why are we always mimicking a man climaxing all the time when there are so many other ways to write a narrative? And, and this goes back to, and you could say that sort of all of the books that we've read that I'm going to be talking about, you could say that they're all kind of like these prose poems. And I call them prose poems because prose poems are also defies any kind of genre whatsoever. But I would say that one aspect of the prose poem that I think fits with all of, one definition of the prose poem is that the prose poem is a kind of cuckoo bird that makes its nest in other genres. It's a mimic, it shapeshifts, it takes on forms such as dictionary entries, letters, 19th century novels, fables, cookbook instructions, and so forth. It's a genre that mimics other genres to expose its artificial boundaries, thereby freeing ourselves of these genres. Coincidentally, Terry Eagleton also said this about the novel. The novel cannibalizes other modes of genres and mixes the bits and modes promiscuously together. But I think we forget that. Because we're so used to reading novels that are in a certain kind of format. So here, what that Banu Kappel has done here is she's written, she decided to do a project where she would interview South Asian women And she had this, her procedure was to answer this predetermined selection of 12 questions. And they agreed on the condition of anonymity to submit a spoken or written response in 30 minutes. I don't know if she actually did this, but she also said that they were locked in a room without windows, furniture, or overhead lighting, which seems quite intense. But the book turns into something else, right? So this is what it starts with: the project as I thought it would be, an anthology of voices of women. The project as I wrote it, a tilted plane. It becomes something else when you actually read all of Banu Kapoor's vertical of interrogation of strangers. And these are the list of questions that she asked them. Who are you and whom do you love? Where did you come from? How did you arrive? How will you begin? How will you live now? What is the shape of your body? Who was responsible for the suffering of your mother? What do you remember about the earth? What are the consequences of silence? Tell me what you know about dismemberment. Describe a morning you woke without fear. How will have you prepared for your death? And 12, what would you say if you could? And I'm going to actually stop the share so I could just look at your, so I could just like see your chat about, I'm gonna, so I could see the chat as well. Does everyone, I hope everyone has the PDF on screen, but I wanted to ask you what you found, if you noticed anything distinctive about the questions that she chose to ask. What makes the questions different from like typical oral testimony, oral history questions that are usually, one usually is familiar with?
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm Edie, and what's different is that these are asked about someone as a subject, not what their external things are, like their numbers or their address or things that like a government document would look for.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like recognizing the interviewer as a person, with a full person with feelings and history.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not geographically pointed. It doesn't ask for kind of, they're not really so much factually based. There are also other people, I think questions are rooted in accessing vulnerability. It's very, each one demands that you create a world to answer them. I also think they make space for interiority. That's great. Yeah, I also think they make space for interiority as well. You know, and also it's also, the questions are kind of presumptuous too, don't you think? You know, it's not, did your mother suffer? It's who was responsible for the suffering of your mother? So there's also kind of, you know, these questions kind of put you on the spot as well. And in that way, it kind of turns into a bit of an interrogation, right? Where you're kind of forced to answer. And it is rather disarming. I want to turn this into an in-class exercise, and where like the time is just flying by. So I want to talk about this, but you know, I really recommend reading all of, if you haven't already, some of you probably already have read The Vertical Interrogation of Strangers. It really, what she says is that she thought it would be an anthology of the voices of Indian women. And she said, the project as I wrote it, a tilted plane, it becomes something different. So you have expectations reading the introduction where you think it's going to be an anthology of voices. And then as you read it, it's much more personal than that. And it's about, and it traverses geographies, London, South Africa, India, and where the voice is actually quite personal and more seamless than you expect it to be, where she talks about her, they're more like love poems about her relationship with this South African man. And I've taught this book before, and I like it because it's actually kind of a perplexing book in that you come in expecting it to be one narrative, a bunch of narratives, and she defeats that by going in a different direction. And I think what happened throughout her process, I'm not actually sure if this is true, is that she felt compelled to answer these questions herself.
Mm-hmm.
She wanted to answer these questions. She had to unpack these questions herself, for herself. And she was saying that after she finished the vertical interrogation of strangers, readers wrote in. She got letters, emails, and so forth, where readers also answered her questions, the 12, either one or all of the questions. And they answered it however they want. And one thing that's so beautiful about these open-ended questions is you could answer it poetically. It could be a prose poem, it could be a lyric poem, it could be a short story, it could be even like a drawing, it could be anything you want. And I think it's like there's something that's so intimate that opens up yourself to these questions that people, I think readers are just drawn to. So if you haven't already guessed what my prompt is, I'm sorry to rush to the prompt, but I would like to squeeze in some one generative exercise here. Is I want us to take 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes or so, and I want you to choose one of these questions. And I want you to write your response. And please be as creative as you want. It could be a lyric poem. Again, it could be a short story. It could be a scene. It could be it could just be the same word over and over and over again. And I know there's a question that you are scared to answer, and there's a question that you probably are going to zero in on, and I'm like, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to answer this question instead. I would challenge you to pick the question that scares you. Okay. So I'm going to give you 10 to 15, say, what do you think? 10 minutes, okay? And then we'll come back and hopefully some of you will be willing to share your responses, okay? Hey, everyone. Maybe we should reconvene. Cathy? Am I can't, oh, there I am.
Yes, you're great.
All right. I know that probably wasn't as much time as you, I hope you got it to manage to get some, a little bit down on the page. I realize it's also 4:10 and I can stay a little if you guys, if Cathy and Kyle are willing, and if any of you want to stay on a little bit longer, I can go a little bit off longer to answer questions and so forth. Because I think we're kind of entering into the hour when I do Q&A, and but I also just want to hear your voices and hear your responses. So I was thinking maybe what we can do is, if anyone can, people who want to volunteer, and Cathy, if you have an efficient way of doing this, please let me know. But I was just thinking anyone who wants to volunteer reading their response to, again, unmute themselves and just read your response aloud. I'm dying of curiosity, but if you're feeling a little bit shy, you can just like type in a few lines from your response on the chat function as well, or you could do both. But I really hope that you guys all of you can be bold enough to step forth and read your response. I would really love to hear.
Great. George would love to share. So feel free, everybody else, to just, type up your something into the chat of your writing. But yeah, George, go for it.
Hi, everyone. I responded to the question that was, I think it was, I closed the page, but I think it was how have you / how will you prepare parentheses D for your death. I practice being still sometimes. I stand so still, my heartbeat makes my teeth chatter. I have even rehearsed once or twice the closing of my eyes with finality. Not at all like the gates that crash at the threshold of fortune, but gentle like ash that settles on a book which will never be read again.
Thank you. That was really lovely. Really beautiful.
Okay, so in the chat, Keith D. Wright, you would like to read a few lines?
I responded to the questions, how will you live now? I will live the whole day, every day, extinguishing real and imagined obstacles, roadblocks, time robbers, miserable procrastinations, calling you to listen to recycled woes and sad stories. No, now we create new moments, new memories. I will live now, in the now, seeing, hearing, listening, watching, appreciating, discerning, decoding, green light, red light, like we used to move as kids, having fun outdoors in the sun, no bills, no jobs, no worries, smiles and smiles and smiles, new moments, new memories. I will live now, unmasked, except for my COVID mask, all others destroyed, buried, archived under the lock and key, available only to the stories for grandchildren. Peepaw, how did you and Umi meet? Peepaw, did you ever? Peepaw, can you? The grands will get a front row seat. I will live now, knowing they will have a future without my presence, but full of my memories.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Alice Yang, you're next. And I'm just gonna read, people are signing up through the chat and I'll just read down, but feel free to share also if you don't wanna read out loud. your lines there. Alice Yang.
Hi, who are you and whom do you love? I was born of the sea. They call children like us sea turtles, even if we only swim back to the motherland in dreams. I drew my flippers in so close I could no longer feel my body. Forgot I could have swam. I didn't know my days like my body were mine. And then the tides pulled me back to grandparents who had never forgotten the shape of my face. And I learned then that I was more traveler than daughter. I was more heretic than heir. Then I met you, a boy whose eyes resemble millions and remind me still of myself. Between the years rising, between the countries parting, between my legs, I feel you coming, that plane arriving, energy rising, the border gates opening. I feel myself meeting you there then, when we can move beyond what we know and do not know, beyond what we can and cannot touch. I'm laying words out, you're holding me open, all at once we are dreaming.
Thank you so much. Up next, I have Dorothy.
Scary. Okay. Who is responsible? Well, Cathy, you said pick something that would scare me, right? So, who is responsible for the suffering of your mother? None I was responsible for my mother's suffering. I would have pointed to my father, but he was an impulsive afterthought in her desire to get out. I grew up thinking my mother was a cat with 9 lives because I can think of the flood, the fire, the lantern of fire, and me that almost killed her. But no, it was you, Nana, you hit her. Well, I want to believe there was and is no, there is a such thing as a soft blow. Your hand was as thunderous as a humid, rainy thunderstorm night. You didn't have to speak for me to know your secrets. And one time, a time I regret, I made my mother cry because I pressed on and on about why she would come to your rescue. I swear sometimes I imagine putting my fingers on my mother's right wrist and her trying to find her pulse to tap out like Morse code the ways you brutalized her. Without words, I can imagine your stern face. She learned not to cry from you, but she cried like a baby and wailed out an innumerable amount of I'm sorries to you as you laid before us with flowers more than I had ever seen. Yet you were the one that took me out of the closet. You gave me money every Christmas and birthday I had until you were gone. Mom told me how much I was like you. You found it hard to forgive. You sang songs in your register. You cooked what you mastered. You found solace in prayer and silence. You cleaned up after others without question. Yet you couldn't muster an apology to my mother. And I hate myself for the thorns I failed to pick off my fingers when I tried to read my mother's pulse.
So moving. Thank
you so much. I have next, I don't want to mispronounce your name, but I have E-L-I. So it's Ellie or Eli?
Eli.
Eli.
Yeah, I really like how that lie goes off the tongue. But I chose number 9. Tell me what you know about dismemberment. And as a heads up, there is a mention of blood in this piece. So if you're sensitive to that, just letting you know. It has come early. I know it hasn't, but I tell myself it has. I think my period is here, I command myself to say, but I know it's not true. A blotch on my underwear like a shattered crustacean. But the blood is light, more a tincture than a whirl of gore and diffused membrane. The blood runs dry eventually. My body performs like a renovated home. Wayne-coasted walls no longer damp, foundation somehow intact. Each weave in the upholstery corseted tighter than it was before. But the memory herself is phantom, like the space between a camellia's threshed core. Momentum's kick into the kinetic. She runs like a river divorced of its ability to erode. Gathering, gathering, and gathering. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Naomi next. I love all the affirmations in the chat. Thank you so much. Oh, it's very scary to read sometimes, so it really helps people. So Naomi?
So I actually added a line in conversation with Dorothy. I grew up thinking my mother was a witch. Did you know people converted? Maria Sinicuan, a sacred manga. As a child, my mother practiced on a piano with broken keys in the common room of a mental hospital. Did you know people translated? broken keys, patient witnesses, listening to the classics. Maria Cacao, A Sacred Mountain in Cebu. Bach, Beethoven, Chopin. Bendita eres entre todas las mujeres. Sonatas. Born Maria, she wanted to be called Victoria, the conqueror. Pampanga is where the Guardia de Honor held strongest. They were fervently religious peasant organizations based on the veneration of the Virgin. Everyone's named Maria. Silent composers. They resisted from the mountain. The classics, not Victoria, Toyang. The Guardia de Honor de Maria, sisters assigned to sit up and pray through the night. The adherents are described to be dressed immaculately in satin. Maria Makiling, a sacred mountain in Laguna. Tagalog is not my mother tongue. I returned for her. Did you know there's a land? It's been dismembered. It's been remembered. She composes herself by losing her way. Did you know that land was taken? Do you make offerings to other spirits? Tagalog is my mother's tongue. Perfect English. Hail Mary, full of grace. Why are you learning Tagalog? No one speaks that anymore. They all speak English.
Powerful, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks also for people who are sharing their pieces in the chat. That's wonderful. Up next is Jen Tan.
Hey folks, thanks for all sharing and all the comments. I also answered the question, who's responsible for the suffering of your mother? I cannot tell you this without naming him, him, and him. I cannot tell you this without naming her and her. Their blood runs through me so that I feel I must avenge and take on, overcompensate for her, for my mother. There's 49% of space in my heart that is just the grudges I hold against those who have made my mother suffer. And so when you see me walking around this city, my heart is thumping against hard grains, no, hard rocks, no, volcanic rocks, no, slabs of New York City concrete, yes. It's hardened and the blood masses form and not flow. It's the same blood as my father's, my aunts, my uncles, my grandmother's, my blood that hardens against my chest. So when my mother calls me in her tears, I hang up afterwards and the 49% increases to 50, so that half my body is the anger I hold and the other half the same blood as those who have wronged her. Thank you.
That was really well. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 3 more people who volunteered. I also don't want to mispronounce your name, but I have Mariam?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
The consequences of silence are eating. The consequences of silence are beating. Consequences of silence are bleating. Consequences of silence are your mother talking out loud to God all alone in an early AM room. The consequences of silence are bloating. The consequences of silence are goading. The consequences of silence are moting. The consequences of silence are your brother turned dragon with borrowed fire, breathing in smoke from a pyre of burning cigarettes in a windowless closed room. The consequences of silence are wailing. The consequences of silence are flailing. The consequences of silence ultimately are maiming. The consequences of silence aren't even actually ever silence, are the thuds of fists from your ancestors wailing, finding themselves a funeral to process in, ganeza ishpao fi halatn, beating the walls of their own chests. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you. It's amazing. Thanks for the affirmations. Up next is Jin.
Hello. Okay, thank you. This may be a little grammatically chaotic, but I will proceed. Okay. The other ones are easier. Obvious. Me. I have caused the suffering of my mother, and I know dismemberment so intimately I can describe it in any time and order. However, who I am and who I love is what confounds me daily. The fear is that they're left blank forever, perhaps until I fabricate an answer, forge, or until no one asks me anymore. My soul is my protector, my mind is my governing body, my body is a child nursed and coddled by whoever can. At the center of this town, it is written, who I am. Who I love is not written anywhere. Because who I love is only seen, magnificent, phantasmic views, in passing like the most beautiful clouds I've ever seen, drift over these roofs. Who I love is a changing story that is told and retold again, each time a new slant of light touching down, gold on the face of matter. Who I love is a forbidden book list, so maybe it is written somewhere, or everywhere, but I've relegated it to the hushed night passages, edges muffled by sleeping quilts and worn memories, worn mouths, worn eyes of the mind. How many books were discovered and burned? How many turned up in boxes of personal belongings and turned away? How beautiful will the words be if I ever read them? How many will make me cry, weep, lust, marvel, wonder? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have, feel free to write your affirmations into the chat and drop in any more. Somebody else has volunteered, and this will be the last. So we have 2 more people. So Cherry's next, and then the final person is Z on deck. Because I definitely want to get to Vanessa's work. So Cherry?
Yeah, hi everyone. Sorry I'm not a poet, so if it sucks. I chose number 5, what is the shape of your body? This is not a poem, this is a story. A merchant is selling an object, a cocoon. He tells a person passing as a lady walking by that she will be a butterfly if she buys it. But if I buy it and decide not to be inside, will I still become a butterfly? The merchant says, you have to try it first before you become a butterfly. The woman took out fortune cookies from her bag, stared at the merchant, and started eating the fortune cookies, pulling fortunes out and reading them. Crunch, 1. 2 eyes looking at the hollow of thighs. Crunch, 2. Lips suckling on brown breasts. Crunch, 3. A mirror telling truth and lies. 4. A container for bones. 5. A promise that keeps growing. The woman becomes, she looks at the merchant and opens her jaw. What is the shape of my body? And the merchant cries out, you're a butterfly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love fiction. We're all.
Poets are the ones who are apologizing.
I know. This is the truth. Thank you. And last person, Z, would you like to share?
Yeah, is this, all right, is this Ricky?
Yes, can hear you.
Cool. Okay, I chose How Will You Begin? I think that's the one. Instructions. I still want to ask for your favorite colors, as if we are at the beginning of age and language. Element for the weighing in on a choice, say if paint swatch for the future color of someone else's baby room, or which cup to use informed by what we remember of a person. To develop vocabulary in this new mode of communication, I practice gestures the mother tongue would categorize as familiar. The muscles in the face must move differently to roll an R. I am slowly rolling towards it, the unit of comfort measured in 2 or more agreements, an occasion of being and not feeling alone. Oral exercise beginner. 1, I'm sorry. 2, you're right. 3, could I ask for a favor? 4, what is your favorite color? 5, actually, I don't want to talk about it, thanks. 6, will you not marry me? 7, I know it's not really your thing, but want to come with me to the thing? 8, could I have a little sip? 9, it is so good to hear your voice. Perfect future. I can't wait till we will have known which questions to ask. Although there's an O in questions, the phonetic sandwich tns produces more of a short I or U sound, not to be confused with the long I or the long U, which is just what we say when we read those letters loud. In the English alphabet, a letter is long by default, so I apologize for it. Yep.
Thank you so much.
It's so great. Thank you all for reading your responses. That was really, you know, they're all so distinctive and powerful and beautiful and raw and vulnerable. And I really am grateful for you guys to kind of expose your vulnerability. It really was really lovely to hear. I wanted to, I wanted to talk about Beast Meridian before we run out of time. One last thing I want to say, we could talk about vertical interrogation of strangers. I recommend that all of you read the whole book. When we talk about embodying witness, being, there's vertical interrogation is so embodied, you know, in the sensuality of the language itself, where she really seems to be writing within her body. And I, you know, going back to this idea, going back to this sort of environment where we're looking at it, this kind of image saturated world that we're looking at, I think a lot of us are missing experience, right? And when we're looking at images or even doing sometimes Zoom, it feels oddly vacated of experience. And what I appreciate about vertical interrogation of strangers is how embodied it is, how textural it is, how it prioritizes not sight necessarily, but smell and touch, smell, touch, and taste, which we don't use or think of as much, and as much. And this is sort of a prompt. I like to give this prompt to my students. I gave it to this prompt to my students when they were last semester, when we had to cut off on-campus teaching and go Zoom, and everyone was just like, just freaking out about everything. And I was like, I just wanted, every week I wanted them to write a poem that had touch in some way, that used the sensories, the sensation of touch, because I think that is the one sensation that a lot of us miss. You know, there probably are some of us who haven't hugged someone for months, and you know, and there's a lot of touch and vertical interrogation of strangers. I want to move on to Beast Meridian. Vanessa, I don't want to put you on the spot, but since you're here, I am really excited at the idea of, you know, this actual, the poet being in the room with us. And I'm hoping that maybe you could share a little bit of your experience writing this book, or maybe even read from Beast Meridian a little bit. I chose Beast Meridian, first of all, because I think it's just a really beautiful and harrowing book. And this is an example, I think Beast Meridian is an example of documentary poetry turned inward rather than outward. I mean, so is vertical interrogation. So it's like investigative poetry does not necessarily have to be you kind of embedding yourself in an outside community, but you kind of doing investigation of your family and lineage and yourself. And I think also for those who are not poets, but those who are fiction writers and nonfiction writers, what Beast, you could almost say it's a kind of like a radical Bildungsroman, you know, where it just chronicles adolescence, immigrant adolescence in such a painful way, in the way that like you know, certain coming of age novels do. But what Vanessa employs is all these different modes, like footnotes. It's a polyphony of genres. There's a polyphony of Spanish, there's Spanish and English. There's also footnotes. There, there are also footnotes, prose poems, lists, and so forth. And it's just, it's such a textured body of writing. And are you still there, Vanessa?
I am. I'm here.
Would you be willing to talk about your book a little bit?
Yeah. Do you want me to read from it first, or thank you, by the way, also for teaching this book.
Yeah, I have taught it in the past, and students have adored it. But I was wondering if you could just read a little bit, just a little bit from the assimilation runes, because that's what I, that's what I excerpted in the packet. And maybe you could, I'll keep it open-ended, but maybe what you could say a little bit about, if you could sort of talk about like, your process, and were you thinking about the history? Were you thinking about the genre of documentary poetry at all when you're working on this book, and what you were trying to do with your source material? I mean, one thing I'll just say is really there's a lot of kind of a sociological textbook. Vanessa text incorporates a lot of textbook excerpts of psychological kind of descriptions of assimilation and so forth, and a lot of it is also about sort of education, and the imposition of standardized English, and by excerpting those kind of more official texts, you're showing sort of the violence of the frame, so to speak, so to say. So, you could respond in any way, but I would love to just have you talk about it in any way that you want. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually really love the excerpts that you chose, and because I hadn't seen the Shakespearean sonnet palimpsest. I actually didn't know what the word palimpsest was until my MFA, and so I was just experimenting with this idea of the sense of assimilation as a kind of self-erasure, and feelings of the self disappearing, feelings of family narratives disappearing. And really what I was trying to do is, I remember just the textures of photos and saint cards being like these textures of memory from my adolescence that felt grounding in a time when I was surrounded by whiteness and being made daily to enter these spaces, these violent spaces of whitening and shrinking. And so the poem format itself conjures both the photograph and the sort of tight space of a prayer and a saint card that you carry with you, but also the surrounding whiteness as this isolation and removal from family, which is this collective rhizomatic support system. And then once we moved away to Houston, this feeling of just utter isolation and alienation. And so, I was really thinking about the photograph, the saint card, surrounding the text in whiteness as a kind of constraint on the form throughout. My new work, when I was writing about this particular time in my life, it was just a really wild time. And so a lot of can you hear? I'm sorry, my son is being, he's playing loudly.
It's great.
So this was just such a chaotic time in my life that I felt a lot of shame about. And the way we remember this time, no one ever talks about a lot of the trouble that I got in with, teachers, police, getting sent to alternative school, being expelled, and eventually being put in a mental institution. It was just a really harrowing, 3 years. And so in trying to sort of remember and do justice to this time and sort of access memory that was very quickly fragmenting and that my own mother was kind of erasing in the telling, and my own family, I should say, the only way I knew how to anchor it in the absence of documents was through things that helped that time make sense. So it was these charts. There's actually a lot that's missing. The original was a much more expansive, write-ups I'd gotten and things like that, but my mom felt uncomfortable sharing a lot of these documents because they're just ugly, which is another thing you'll run into, by the way. Ways that you want to tell the truth and your own family silences or limits you in some way. And so I just wanted to capture these moments of confusion and anchor them in some way to prove that they'd happened. So it was like this refusal to be gaslighted, or this refusal for this ugly story, this shameful story to be overwritten in some way. And so, you know, this first poem that has like the fading Spanish, the Spanish is also like a very infantilized Spanish. So it's, you know, the self that's being sort of disappeared or overwritten by these, you know, English words that sort of stick, and this painful memory. The first time I'd ever heard of the boogeyman and being locked into this room in a daycare by the white kids and sort of being stuck there until someone found me hours later. Hello. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
That's what happens to me all the time when I'm doing. I always have my my daughter just, you know, it's just part of the.
It's just part of the deal. Yeah. So I guess I don't know, which one should I read? I'll read the In Gym one because that one's the most uncomfortable one, and this is safe space.
Yes, I love that one.
Okay. In Gym, admire white girl nipples, soft and pink as sow's ears, so unlike your own dark. In physics, learn parallax, the effect of position upon viewing an object. In English, learn the grades are from Europe. New York, use parallax in a poem. B-, learn your place is beneath the blondes who snitch on you. See them off to college from behind a register, a farewell to arms. On the road, they're bound for Europe, Harvard, Columbia, New York. Cash your check at the Veterans Memorial, quick cash, know your place is going nowhere. Wrong side of the highway, crime forest they call us. In government, argue with Mr. Lockwood, who teaches the Confederate flag means states' rights. Detention before work, apron stinks up your backpack. Catch a ride, learn to serve classmates with a smile. At home, help mommy lavar los baños to even get to go to the dollar theater. Even after popcorn, your hands still smell raw from the comet and bleach. 2 a.m., feed the baby so mommy can sleep. Shave your fingers and toes before school. Scrub the dark off your nipples. In gym, clock a 7-minute mile. Clean, cotton morning. The only ahead you get. Parallax, the effect of position upon viewing an object. And then below, you know, the footnotes are just pieces from, you know, like the diagnosis and like the entrance paperwork to the, you know, to the mental hospital, which actually closed on like ethics grounds. So when I tried to find documents for Gulf Pines Psychiatric Hospital, I couldn't access those documents. So the documents we had were the only ones that were left. And then also just like some footnotes that are written in this like really clinical language that were like the only sort of defenses for myself that I could find in like, you know, these texts, which in the next page becomes sort of like this, when you see yourself, or when you see like a condition that you've never really seen as an explication for depression, the language sort of starts building on itself, or like sort of amplifies the confusion rather than clarifies it. And so I just wanted to sort of, the text to sort of mimic that sense of overwhelmingness. So yeah. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. that was amazing. And thank you for spontaneously giving a little presentation of Beast Meridian. And selfishly, I'm delighted that you did. But I think that also really just kind of illuminated a lot about this book. I recommend, let me just show you, because I feel like this is such a tiny set, this is just a little excerpt, and I just want to just kind of I think visually it's also just really an arresting book where there's a lot of, you know, photo, you know, there's family photos incorporated into it. You know, let me, and then, you know, and some of it is in the lyric, poetic form. And there are a lot of different modalities. Here's another one, a faded photograph in that kind of, that's documentation of, these are your family members. And I think what really is, I think absolutely winning about the your writing is that it's both, it's like, there's such a, you know, it's almost like you're creating this kind of oppositional narrative where you have the psychiatric kind of analysis of you as a subject. And then there's your kind of fragmented voice that's like intruding on here about school, and the white girl nipples, soft and pink as Sal's ears, is something that really kind of is really sticks in your mind. And I was just thinking about just how our erotic, you know, how our, I don't even know how to put this into words, but like how our, you know, how our erotic selves come into being, and how so much of what we are attracted to, or what we find erotic is what's not mirrored as us. I'm trying to make, I'm sorry if I'm a little bit confusing, that's not mirrored as us, as something other than us, but who we long to be. And that who we long to be becomes an object of desire as well. I you know, and I think there's a lot in the kind of fragmented prose poem is both kind of dramatizes the fragmentation of memory, but also it's very visceral, it's very raw. And I think it's, and I really recommend that everyone read Assimilation Room. I also love the span, you know, there's Erasure, which is like Jen Bervin's Nets in the first one, Assimilation Rooms, where you talk about, I mean, I had that experience too when I was a kid, where I think some of us maybe had that experience where we're learning English. And what we forget, you know, really, I think you viscerally see how when you're learning a language, a different language, how it becomes a real kind of imposition upon you, or a framework that excludes you. And I think you really kind of portray that well in Assimilation Rooms, where it's in Spanish. But I also love the kind of the words that you highlighted in The Honey Room. I can read alone in this room with a boogeyman. There's something very eerie and children's book-like about it. It's like both like a sense of, and then in the footnote, it's there's a translation of the Spanish. I don't know if it's an exact, my Spanish is, it's a rough, maybe if it's an exact translation or a rough translation, but it's about being punished, right, for not understanding anything and being forced in the closet. And then trying to kind of make your own world while you're being punished. I thought that was really lovely. I was gonna say we're almost close to 5. I think like one you know, there's one prompt, a personal prompt that's inspired by Vanessa's book, you know, and I hope you don't, you know, is if you're interested in family history, and this is perhaps, it's always, using like visual mediums is always a good way to begin. And you might want to just find, you know, it's just, again, based on Beast Meridian, is to find a family photo. You know, starting with a photo is always really grounding and anchoring in a way, because you have a kind of a visual aid that you could start from. and you find a photo of your family, and then first of all start, just first of all, as poetically as you want, describe what's happening in the photo. This is an ekphrastic exercise, like describe what's happening, and then you say, after you've described what is in the photo, describe what was happening during that time that's not in the photograph. And then that may help sort of like trigger lots of, some memories that are kind of lodged in your subconscious. And if you want to even take it further, you could go and interview the subject, either the subject that's in the photo album, or interview the person who you wish was in the photo. That's another one. Or you could, there could be variations of that, or of the fantasy interview that you want with the person that you wish was in the photo. Could be another, play on that uses more the imagination as well. And I just wanted to give you a little quote. As you'll notice, there are a lot of, like, if you think about there are other documentary poems, like texts like Teresa Hakyung Cha's Dictée, or Sebald's Austerlitz and Emigrants, or Michael Ondaatje's collected works of Billy the Kid, or there are a lot of, like, they often use a lot of images. And I want to just say this one, I just want to quote Hito Sterol about the poor image, and a lot of times the image is a little bit faded. And I just think it's a beautiful kind of explanation of why we are so attracted to these kind of poorly reproduced images, as kind of archival material. The poor image is a copy in motion. Its quality is bad, its resolution substandard. As it accelerates, it deteriorates. It is a ghost of an image, a preview, a thumbnail, an errant idea, an itinerant image distributed for free, squeezed through slow digital connections, compressed, reproduced, ripped, remixed, as well as copied and pasted into other channels of distribution. The poor image is a rag or a rip, an AVI or a JPEG, a lumpen proletarian in the class society of appearances, ranked and valued according to its resolution. The poor image has been uploaded, downloaded, shared, reformatted, and re-edited. It transforms quality into accessibility, exhibition, value into cult value, films into clips, contemplation into distraction. The image is liberated from the vaults of cinemas and archives and thrust into digital uncertainty at the expense of its own substance. The poor image tends towards abstraction. It is a visual idea in its becoming. And then it goes out. But anyway, I thought that was a very good description of Hito Sterol's quote. Someone wrote, someone also just said the poet Chen Chen answered some of Banu's questions and made this fabulous lyric essay. Thank you for that. I haven't read that, and I would love to read that, check that out as well. We're almost at 5 o'clock. There's a lot of material that I wanted to cover that I didn't get a chance to, but I wanted to, Cathy or Kyle, do you think I should open it up to Q&A?
I am, because there were so many questions asked earlier and answered, I was wondering if you felt comfortable maybe, selecting maybe some parting material, some just like parting material that you'd like to do in the next 6 minutes that might be either strategies for thinking about like I love the prompt for the photographs, so I don't know, would that be okay? And then yeah, I think there was a lot of, I didn't know that there would be a lot of questions in the middle, so I feel like that might be really useful.
Sure.
Oh, there's a question. Could we have a copy of some of the things we did not have time to cover? Is one question. And the other one is writing strategies, please, from the group.
Formal and writing strategies, please. Yes. Okay. So I will, I actually kind of, I gave one of them already, but let me just, share screen. Here's some of the prompt ideas that I kind of typed in, and I already already told you what one of them are. Sorry. Find a document that's 50 years or older and do an erasure project. This is based off of nets. This is one that I've already told you about. Find a family photo, describe the photo, then write what is not in the photo that was happening at the time. Interview the subject of that photo. And this is this is a prompt based on Carolyn Forche. Provide an eyewitness account starting with the sentence, "What you heard is true." And maybe this could be, if some of you had problems with the kernel, it could be a response, it could be like, it could be like the kind of anti-Forche sort of poem, or how you would approach this idea of witness differently. It could be a response to Carolyn Forche herself, or, or you could just take it into your own path. What you heard is true. I think actually this is a prompt that I've done before with some of my undergrads, and there's just something so potent about that first line that it triggers a lot of different memories when you hear that. Find a painting. In the, a lot of the museums are shut down, but we have access to all of these visual art archives. Find a painting or a sculpture or an installation in the Metropolitan Museum collection or the gallery of your choice, and use it to write about what is happening now in this country. So I think a lot of times, like, there's a lot that's difficult. It's difficult to kind of pin down, but when you're starting from another source material, it's much more helpful. This is based on Salma Sharif's look. Find a specialized dictionary. Salma Sharif used military terms, a dictionary of military terms. It could be like, it could also be a dictionary of your first language or your second language. It could be Shakespearean terms, it could be dance hall terms, and incorporate those words into your writing. So those are some of the prompts. And a larger prompt idea is just to kind of and I've also just asked my students in the past to just do a documentary poetic project, beginning with, embedding yourself in, if you want to do something more ambitious, within a community that you feel connected to, or that you feel a desire to connect yourself to. This could be extended family. This could be whatever organization that you're part of. Another Louis Selly wrote, shoot, what was that? What?
Valeria Louis Selly. Does anybody know this book?
Tell Me How It Ends? Tell Me How It Ends?
Yes.
Tell Me How It Ends. Yes, that's it. I'm terrible with titles. I remember the book, but that is actually a really great example of a book, a docu-poetic book, as a form of, as a book of essays, where she worked with undocumented migrant children. And what she and she, you know, had to ask them a set of questions. In a way, it's a lot like vertical interrogation of strangers in that it's based off of these questions. And she writes about her experience interviewing these children and what's happening. And there's like, it's also a great example of what Trinity Minha talks about writing nearby, where she's like, she writes about her own vulnerabilities, but it's also, she like just, I don't know, I love that book, but it's like, it's also just, she really sheds a very sensitive, very responsible light on these migrant children. So another prompt would be read that book. And before you launch this, and you know, and embed yourself in a group, whether it's someone who's it's family or you know, someone who a group that you're not really connected to in some way, and really be an active witness, you know, where you interview them, where you interview people, where you, you know, you interview your subjects, you try to like talk to them as much as you can, collect documents, archive material, and so forth, and write a sequence of poems or prose paragraphs that also use some of the documentary archive material as so what you're creating is a kind of assemblage. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we are at time. So just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us. Yeah, we're just so grateful to Cathy for offering up such knowledge and wisdom and these texts for us to think about. Thank you to Kyle for putting all of this together, to DJ, our lovely intern, to you all for holding the space and filling it in with your words, with your ideas, with your you know, like your protests, your all of it. It's been a rich discussion, and the 3 hours really flew by. Oh my goodness! So thank you so much.
People's attention span tends to kind of like, you know, Zoom, it's like scientifically proven that after the first 3, it's like, oh my God, so I hope it wasn't too drawn out. It was a lot of information, and there was more information that I could have stuffed in there. So, you know, it's not the best medium, but thank you. Thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Kundiman.
Also, thank you to Vanessa for your
Vanessa.
beautiful words. And yeah,
You
so
guys
thank you, everybody.
me so much and helped me, and that was great.
All right. Well, have a great evening, everybody. We say farewell for now.